That is what they believe. I know that she did not do this. There are a lot of unanswered questions.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Tomorrow is day 10, probably the final trial day before a verdict. And I will be in court tomorrow to listen to those final arguments. Hope you guys will also tune in to, it will be televised, will be live streamed, so I hope you guys will also follow wherever you are. And so basically, we want to conclude our analysis based on the testimony we've heard, all the revelations, and sort of encapsulate it in a coherent conclusion. And then that is the challenge. Are we able to do that? And that brings us to what I feel are the two biggest clues we've all missed or overlooked. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you've appreciated my content and my coverage, please do subscribe, like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So I am reporting from Austin. Tomorrow will be my last day in Austin before starting the long haul home. But in terms of this case, I think to some, the Armstrong case seems to be not only boring, but boringly obvious. Is there anything really to say about it? So obvious that it might be a cliche. But like so many true crime cases, the intrigue is in the nuance, in the subtlety, the details, the little things going on in those obvious dynamics, within those obvious dynamics. For me, each of the characters in the story has a fascinating rags to riches story. Now, each story on its own is actually quite a hero's journey. And it's a story that is in many ways a lot more colorful and compelling than the stories we typically see in true crime. Stories playing out in suburban households, cases not involving sport, not involving world-class athletes, not involving sporting celebrities. It's also easy to simplify this case into a geometric shape, with the most important tangent being KAITLIN Armstrong. KAITLIN did it. It's obvious. It was a love triangle, as simple and easy as that. Of course, people and relationship dynamics have a lot more facets than, say, a triangle or a square. If someone had to reduce you to a circle or a rectangle, would you say that basically represents all of who you are? Now, sitting in court today, just a few rows behind KAITLIN's divorced parents, and also a few rows behind Mo's family, one has a sense of their hope and support for their daughter. For them, this is the worst nightmare. And though I couldn't see KAITLIN's mother's face, just the back of a white blouse and blonde hair, and I couldn't see much of her father's face, just the grizzly grey beard and bald head, seemed to be quite a large figure. One realizes this is also a tragedy for the defendant and for her family, no matter what the outcome. In this analysis, I want to lift us out of the what can one call it, the leafy fabric, right? And hover over the psychological woods of the case, looking at two of what I consider the most important clues. Number one, the number one clue we all missed, and it's this: they lived together. When Colin arrived home on that fateful night, KAITLIN wasn't there. That's it. This was an obvious red flag right in the beginning, but in a real sense, it was always the biggest red flag of all. They live together. Colin arrives home late at night, and KAITLIN's not there. Now, on the night leading into day 9 of the trial, I couldn't sleep. I actually got up to scribble down a few notes And it was a weirdly portentous thing, because what I wrote down actually came out a little bit in court late this afternoon. But I suppose one could say there was there's this obvious epiphany, but I don't know if epiphany is the right word for seeing the obvious for what it is. But the epiphany is simply this: KAITLIN wasn't home when Colin returned late at night, right? They live together. Colin returns late at night and KAITLIN's not home. Why? Why is she not home? It seems like a very simple question, but if you ask her this question, is she able to answer it? And doesn't this question basically address the whole case? Why are KAITLIN and Colin not together late at night? Well, where is Colin? And because Colin's not home, why is KAITLIN not at home? Taking it a bit further, can she account for her movements late at night for several hours when her romantic rival was murdered? Why not? And that's the other thing that we learned later on, was that this woman was a kind of romantic rival in her heart, in her mind, and probably also in Colin's heart and in his mind. Now, on just this simple hinge, just this one question, you can forget all the evidence, all the CCTV, all the DNA, all the relationship dynamics. If you didn't know anything else, you didn't know any of the relationship history, you didn't know who these people were or what was going on, just that Colin and KAITLIN lived together, and that Colin returned from someone's house, someone who was murdered, right? And KAITLIN then returned after that. Well, so much turned on this hinge. And as I say, this was on the night of the murder, May 11th. It was a Wednesday. It was the middle of the week. And Colin returns home, and guess what? KAITLIN's not there. Colin expected KAITLIN to be there, but she wasn't. KAITLIN, in a sense, I think also expected Colin to be home, in the sense of, you my partner, you my boyfriend, I expect you to be home. But I think she also had suspicions surrounding those expectations, suspicions that she'd learned over time. We do know that Strickland texted Armstrong at 21:21 or 21 minutes past 9, but none of his texts were delivered because Armstrong's phone was off. And didn't that register with him as well? I'm texting my partner, the person that I live with. I'm trying to reassure her. I'm trying to mislead her. I'm trying to provide a kind of alibi for where I am when I'm not actually there. But meanwhile, she doesn't really care, because she's on her own mission. She's already taking matters into her own hands, isn't she? And here's the rub. Again, Colin and KAITLIN both live together. It's one thing to go and meet somebody, but if you're living together, it's almost like you're married. It's a higher level of fidelity if you live with someone and you go out and meet someone else than if you just boyfriend and girlfriend. And so, anyway, Colin arrives home late, but KAITLIN's not home either. She arrives even later, approaching 10 p.m. on a weeknight. What does he say to her when she gets home? What does she say to him? Now, I want to quote from Alex Capariello's tweet sent today, November 16, just referring to some of the testimony that Colin Strickland gave late this afternoon. The state was asking about when KAITLIN Armstrong came home on the 11th of May. Strickland says Armstrong was driving, and she did not say she was loaning the vehicle to anyone else. As for the helmet, that's the motorcycle helmet, Strickland says he and Armstrong both had their own helmets. Occasionally Armstrong would wear his, but most often she would wear her own. No further questions, witness dismissed. Now, another observation Alex Capariello made was this one. Strickland says he does not know or believe that Armstrong committed the vandalism, since he was with her inside the house most of the night. Same house, but not necessarily the same room, Strickland clarifies. So Strickland seems to be saying that although they were living in the same house, they weren't actually together. Well, I don't know whether Armstrong would say the same thing. What do you think she would say? What do you think she was thinking? Now, you may wonder what an innocent Caitlin may have made of Colin's nocturnal movements had she been waiting for him when he arrived home. And I also think one can say, how innocent was Caitlin in the sense of not knowing anything about Colin at this point by May 2022. But doubly so, what would an infidelious Colin, knowing he was doing what he shouldn't be doing, what would a not-so-innocent Colin make of his mate not being home when he got home, being somewhere out there, while he was somewhere out there being infidelious? And with her phone off as well, bear in mind his phone was also off. I mean, he used the same ruse to explain his lack of contactability while her phone's off as well. Aren't a couple of lights going on? And that is when you don't really know much about this case. When you do know quite a lot about it, when you know the long backstory, the roller coaster, the on again, off again, the blocking of contacts, the fact that Kate had actually called Mo and threatened her directly, and Mo told Colin about this. The prior infidelity on both their parts, wouldn't a top racer's intuition have kicked in and said, couldn't this have happened? Wouldn't that gut feel, and a lot of racers race on gut feel, wouldn't that gut feel have raised red flags simply on the question, where had Caitlin been late at night? Not just late on any night, but on this night of all nights. Did she know something? Did she see something? Did she read something? And why was her phone off? Why was her phone off when it was off? Also, did Colin not contact Mo later that night when he was in bed or in the shower or wherever to say, sleep well? And did she answer him? Did she not answer him? And that brings us to the second clue we all missed. One of the biggest clues I think that we've all missed is this idea of Caitlin, who was always the parent. And I heard this statement made by someone who apparently interviewed Caitlin's sister, and her impression was that Caitlin was always the parent. In court today, looking at Caitlin's parents, who seem so different from most parents seem so well-to-do, seem quite privileged, whereas Caitlin's parents, and I'm not sure about Colin's, but they seem to have had more of a difficult way of getting to where they've needed to go. One does kind of have a sense of a tragic backstory. I don't know if it's true that Caitlin was almost like a mother to her sister and a wife to Colin, but it feels like it's true. If Caitlin's sister Christine testified, she isn't, but if she did, I have a feeling people would soften their emotional stance against Armstrong. Barely 2 weeks after the incident, this is back in May 2022, it was around about the 25th, I think, of May, the Daily Mail published an article quoting a dude called David, who wouldn't reveal his last name and who seemed to know both Colin and Caitlin quite well. David, apparently an inside source, revealed the following. In 2017, which is really just 5 years before the incident, 6 years ago now, Caitlin relocated to Austin to live with her sister. Not Christine relocating to Austin, Caitlin. Caitlin moved to Austin and kind of started rebuilding her life, and her sister kind of had her back. David told the Daily Mail that Armstrong had said her mother was an alcoholic, and she spent her life trying not to be like her. Her brother allegedly also struggled with addiction issues. That's what she told David, and she wanted to help put him on the right path as well. David mentioned they discussed bringing her brother into the trailer business to work and to get him away from bad influences. One senses on their social media, Christine's and Caitlin's, a very close relationship between the sisters. They travel together, they look similar, they go to ball games together, they go to shooting ranges together. Both seem to have pulled themselves out of a dysfunctional place, worked hard, and found a measure of success. One does get a sense that the leader in this endeavor was possibly the older sister, but also that both siblings had one another's backs. And one does have a sense that didn't the younger sister feel obligated, when the older sister was apparently in trouble, to help her out? And isn't this because of this close relationship and this long history of being there for one another that the one sister was there for the other one in her time of need? And then KAITLIN attaches herself to Colin after this long period of building their lives up and working hard. KAITLIN attaches herself to Colin, who is outwardly clean living, is motivated, is successful, like she is. And yet, like KAITLIN herself, there's some gnawing self-esteem issue somewhere rooted in something in the past. Chris Tolley, a 33-year-old friend of Strickland and Armstrong's, was at a table outside the meter when I think he spoke to a New Yorker reporter, and he said the following. He said, "Owning property together." I was like, whoa, that's a big step for Colin. And that's really a question of maturity. KAITLIN had reached a level of maturity and stability. She'd worked hard to get there. She'd worked hard to kind of get herself in a particular financial position, whereas Colin had worked hard in a different way, right? In a sporting sense, in a physical sense, he'd built his body up and he'd built his abilities and skills on a bicycle. But KAITLIN was engaging now in financial relationships and commitments with someone who was perhaps not capable of similar levels of commitment, certainly in that area. I think there is a difference between discipline in the training sense and commitment, also in the training sense. I think there needs to be a balance in both, especially in relationships. KAITLIN seemed committed to Colin, whereas Colin seemed more committed to himself and his sport. Colin seemed disciplined in sport, but less so in love or within romantic commitments. It seems that way. Whereas with KAITLIN, it seems the opposite. She was extremely disciplined when it came to love. It seems that way, perhaps as a result of her upbringing and background. However, the thing that both KAITLIN and Colin seemed to have in common was a kind of lack of discipline when it came to their emotions. So a lack of emotional discipline. And what does all of that what does everything else count for? All that hard work, all that commitment, all that effort, if you throw it away when the dragon of emotion kind of flies in and burns everything, ruins everything. We've seen Colin shoving around photographers outside court as a sort of exhibit in this regard of an emotional lack of discipline. If you think about shooting someone who shows interest in your partner, that's also not the most disciplined way to deal with a relationship problem. But what it may be, and that might be a simplistic way, you might even think it's a satirical, sarcastic way of thinking about that, but what it may also be is someone who has taken control of things her whole life, in the sense of a child who's taking over the parental role because the parent isn't there, right? Someone who's fended off a threat to a fairy tale, like a mother hen. A fairy tale she'd worked very hard for and felt that her partner was perhaps helpless to think for or act for himself. And so the question arises, and this is the one the jury are going to need to evaluate. Didn't KAITLIN assume the same mother role as a sort of tigress, who's defending her cub? Except Christine and Colin were never her cubs. But wasn't that the role that she was accustomed to? The tiger, the mother, the person in charge, the person taking charge. But of course, if she had no mother in her life, perhaps she always felt she had to take matters into her own hands. Does that make sense? And that brings us to the final thing, fairy tale fabric versus the nightmare. And that's part of the reason I've come to Austin is to experience this fairy tale fabric firsthand. And I think I have, moving through the fairy tale fabric of Maple Avenue, wonderful suburbs. There seem to be nice places to live, to grow up, to work, to move through Denver, which seems to be a wonderful city as well, neat, sparkling, a lot going for it, going past the meteor, which I think Colin initially had a stake in, going through the deep eddy pool, also a wonderful little spot. It's free to go in there. I'll talk to you guys a bit more about that at some point. To the house on Fort Clark, going through this fabric when there's a real sense of a fairy tale that was set up. You have a real sense of people that are in a fairy tale setting. A fairy tale in a fairy tale fabric, that there's a seed in a fertile field, and these were fairly young people who were about to start their lives. You have a rocket primed and ready for launch. All it needed was rain and a little time to grow. All it needed was a little space and opportunity to, get on with things. A lot of time and effort had gone into getting things to this point, and then the nightmare. Someone arriving out of the blue to steal it all away. Unfortunately, that's life. I'm not going to take it further than that, except to say what this trial I feel really needed was for that story to be told. The story that I'm telling you, which is not the full story. And I think there would have been tears and there would have been healing if that story was told. I think it would have helped a lot of people beyond the courtroom. I'm not sure if anyone was ready to do that. Not even Mo's family seemed prepared to imagine that Mo may have loved Colin. Unfortunately, that's life as well. People will keep their hard-earned, expensive secrets. People will hold on to what they believe despite the walls of reality moving in around them. So we all have to learn our lessons, our own lessons, and lessons don't come cheap. The learned ones or the ones we never learn from. And this raises for me a very pertinent question. What lesson do you need to learn? If KAITLIN and Colin and Mo were supposed to learn a lesson, and each failed in their own way to learn that lesson, what's the lesson you're not seeing? What's the lesson you're not learning from? Sometimes the lesson is knowing when to quit. Mo quitting Colin, Colin quitting KAITLIN, KAITLIN quitting Colin. If any of these three had acted unilaterally, probably all three would be getting along somehow, somewhere with their own three successful lives. I think you can only do that, know when to quit, when you're honest with yourself. And I think the people surrounding this case, I'm saying beyond KAITLIN, beyond Colin, the people in their orbits, I think they need to, I don't know whether they are being completely honest with themselves generally, but when you're honest with yourself and you're willing to let the world in a little, willing to let the world tap you against your core with an "I told you so," that's when you give a little, and that's when I think you know when to quit and maybe change direction and start, aiming your rocket for a star that is more practically reachable. Anyway, it's either that or trying to insist that we know better while our world begins to unravel. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.